So now that we have abstracted our cart object away into a nice factory function, and remember we're just doing this to cover the first initial bases that we need to learn and understand object-oriented programming. Now in JavaScript, most things are in fact objects of some kind of form. It could be an object literal, it could be some kind of constructor object. We have a lot of possibilities with JavaScript. Now, in the last video, we finished off with actually using our cart.items.splice, where we investigated that our items array was being removed, but we're not in fact using this remove method anywhere in our code. So this kind of breaks the first rule of immutability. Now, typically and traditionally, we might say, is that object-oriented programming wasn't too concerned about immutable practices, which are a more modern approach that we might use in our JavaScript application. So this video is essentially saying, hang on, we've got our object, we've got some of our behavioral methods, we're mutating things. We don't want to keep mutating, and we also see reference errors, and because when we are debugging our code, and it becomes more hard to understand what's happening in the timeline in Chrome Developer Tools. So our problem comes from our createCart function. And in this video, we're going to sort out our data structure so that it is frozen. Now we have covered object.freeze in our functional programming chapter. So this should be nice and familiar if you've taken this part of the course second. So because we can in fact access our cart.items, if this was in fact frozen, we would see an error. Now what we'll do first is go to our items. Now, at the moment, we're using an ES6 shorthand syntax. We're taking our items, which has a default value of an array, and inside our return block, we're just returning that object literal with the items. So this is essentially the exact same as doing something like this and creating a property with the same value as the variable. Now, in ES 2015, we don't need to do items. We can, of course, just simply omit it like this. However, we do want to introduce object.freeze. So this introduces a great use case to bring back the value property. So let's go ahead and say object.freeze, and we'll wrap our items in the brackets. So now when we save things out, we can see cannot add property 0, object is not extensible. And that's happening on line number 6. So let's have a look. Line number 6 here is in fact this.items.push. So immediately, object.freeze is helping us enforce these best practices with object-oriented programming, and we typically use these things in a functional programming sense. However, I personally believe that we can gain a lot and benefit a huge amount from using immutable data structures alongside object-oriented programming. So the fact that we have in fact frozen our data structure means that we can no longer use these mutable methods. So how can we go and fix this? Now, immutability is all about providing a new copy of something to be described as the new piece of state. Now, in JavaScript, as I mentioned, I like to think about my state first and then worry about the implementation of my functions and variables. So let's think about our state first. When we add something, we just simply want to rebind our value of this.items. Now, we're not using a constant, and this is quite nice because it's part of an object, which means that we can, in fact, reassign the value. Now, when we do reassign, we want to reassign an object frozen version of our new state. So where do we get this new state from? Above, let's create a new constant just to break things out, and I'll talk about the practices that we're doing here as well. Now, this should be quite familiar to you. We can say that we want a new object, and what we're going to do, instead of mutating that existing array, we're going to spread in this.items and then simply add our new item to the end of the array. And that, of course, is what's coming through our add function. So when our hot dog down here is added, it comes through the function arguments. We spread this.items into the new array, and then we add item onto the end. So that is our state. And I've deliberately broken this out into a constant. We could, of course, do something like this and paste this in there. However, before we do that, I just want to make sure that you understand that this is the new representation of state, and this is simply where we rebind it and we're freezing it at the same time. So let's hit save and see what we get. So we don't get an error on line number 6 anymore. We fixed this issue. However, we do have an error on line 20. Cannot delete property 0, of object array because it is in fact frozen. Now there's something interesting here, and I'll talk about this momentarily, but essentially what we want to do is the same again. So here we're going to take our index. We don't want to use this find index prototype method anymore because we're not doing it the old school way, which is using our splice. We can in fact remove an item from an array using array.prototype.filter. So let's go ahead and demonstrate. Again, I'm going to keep this nice and simple for you and create a new state object. We're going to say this.items.filter. So this will in fact, any items that pass our test will be returned to us in a new array, and any items that fail our test are not going to be part of our new array. So in fact, this.items.filter is going to do something like this under the scenes for us and construct a new array, but without the item that we want. And the item that we want to exclude is going to be driven by the ID. So here inside the function, let's go ahead and we can say item. All we need to do for this check is say, does the item ID not equal the ID that we're passing in? So what this in fact does from the top, we're going to pass in our ID, which could be our hot dog emoji. We then loop through all of the items which are frozen, and we check if the item ID doesn't equal that particular item ID. So what this will do is give us a new array back without this particular item. Now at the moment we only have one item in our cart, however this will work perfectly fine. Now underneath we can rebind this.items, and again we're going to introduce our friend object.freeze, and I think that breaking out these into different lines where we explicitly saying this is my new representation of our state, and this is my explicit binding where I'm freezing my state. When we rebind it to this.items, when we save, over here we now have a new error, but this is a good error because we have cart.items.splice. So we're in fact getting an error down here because we're trying to mutate something which is now frozen. Now the interesting piece is when we add something like our hot dog, we're going to get a brand new object. So the reason that we have to keep freezing every single time is because we are providing a brand new object. So whenever we change something, we need to refreeze it. So that's exactly what we're doing here. So just keep that in mind. So if we were to comment out our cart.items.splice, we no longer see any errors. So this allows the user, or perhaps you in your code base, to make a mistake. We can provide some mutable methods. However, we've completely locked down this rather public-facing object, and it's public because our createCart function returns us a new object, literal, to our cart variable where we have the items which are completely frozen. Now there's one more thing that I do want to show you, which is quite interesting, and that is the dot is frozen. So what we can in fact do instead of our cart.items.splice, we can wrap this in a console log, and we can say object, and instead of freeze, we can use this is frozen method. So when we save this out, we can then see this in the console that we do in fact now have a true value. So cart.items is frozen, which is why we cannot use mutable methods such as array.splice. So this fixes two of our problems in one, which is absolutely brilliant. It stops people mutating our values on the outside, the public-facing object, and inside we're now adopting these immutable patterns, which I think you can definitely agree are a far better way to compose our data structures. They're much more predictable, and we don't lead into particular errors. So if you ever want to check if an object is frozen, we can go ahead and use this object.isFrozen, which will give us a true or a false reading. If we were to go ahead and do this, reset just our items back, we do in fact see the word of true. Now, can you think why this is? Now, this is actually because we are using a cart.add here. So if we were to comment these out and hit save again, we now see false. So what's happening here? Let me explain. When we cart.add, we're in fact still running this code. So even though we've unfrozen this data here, when we are calling cart.add, we are freezing it again. So at that point in time, our cart items are frozen because the object has been fully replaced with a frozen version. So let's undo those changes. We'll leave things out as items object freeze. And I hope this gives you a really good example and sets us up nicely for diving deeper into object-oriented programming. We're going to be talking about constructor functions, classes, and prototypes much more. But I think this gets a really good grounding for us to learn from. So that's it for this video. We've covered frozen state and some immutable patterns for updating our state, whether it's adding or removing. So that's it for this lesson, and I'll see you in the next one.